Hi everyone. Over the last few weeks, I've been spending some time doing a lot of studies from photo references to try and improve my art skills, and I've come to realise that being able to do studies is a skill in and of itself, and I wanted to make a video to share some of the things that I've learned and hopefully help you guys as well. Also, I just want to say that I don't think there's a right or wrong way to study from references, and this is just a process that works for me and my painting style, which is semi-realistic and sort of painterly. But anyway, before you can even begin drawing, you first need to decide what you actually want to study, and my advice would be to pick one or two key things to focus on and not to try and do too many things at once. So as an example of what not to do, here's a time lapse of a quote study I did around just over a year ago. I basically started off wanting to do a study of armored poses with one specific reference, but then I found a bunch more references and got really excited about them, so I just decided on the fly that this study was going to include lighting and armor and environments, and that I'd quote study multiple references at once, which honestly at this point I don't think I could have even called this a study so much as an original artwork with no real direction. At the time, drawing anything below the waist was still something I already wasn't very confident on, but so was lighting and environments, so I was basically tackling three very major things that I already struggled with and unsurprisingly just got really overwhelmed and demotivated. So I never finished the study and essentially just gave up, which also made me feel bad, and in the end I was quite unhappy with how it turned out and it made me less motivated to continue because it was just difficult. So now I would pick one or two major things to focus on, for example lighting and environments or colour and clothing, etc., and just keep it to one single reference. So find a reference that contains both of the things that I want to study, which not only allows you to focus on more specific things that you want to improve on, but also lowers the barrier to entry and provides more motivation to keep going. So number two, you need to choose the right reference. So not all references are created equal, especially in this current landscape of AI slop. Of course, real life or taking your own references is great because you can develop your artistic eye, especially for things you actually want to study, but don't feel bad if you can't find real life references. Like guys, I simply don't have the time or patience to travel to a museum every time I want to draw armor, so again, lower the barrier to entry. Also, guys, I'm sorry, I know Pinterest is full of AI slop, but overall I have yet to find a replacement site that has images with the same aesthetic vibes that I'm looking for, which is why I still use it, okay? So I just turn on the no AI filter that they recently put on and specifically hunt for real photo references, and if you spend a bit of time hunting you can actually find some nice photo references that aren't AI. And overall I would not recommend using AI images as a tool for study because they often have warped / abnormal anatomy and perspectives, so you'll kind of just end up studying the wrong thing. If your goal is to be as real or photorealistic as possible, then you'll need to learn from reality, and if your goal is to be able to draw in your own style, translating and interpreting reality provides a much more solid foundation for you to be able to study that than using AI. For example here, obviously my goal wasn't a photorealistic study. I wanted to study lighting, but capturing it in a way that's visually appealing for me and works with my style. By studying this real life photo, I was able to learn what I need to include and what I can simplify for my style. Like lighting in real life has so many extreme subtle color variations that make it look realistic because, you know, light is bouncing off and reflecting off things in all directions and some visible light gets absorbed, etc, etc, but I only want to capture that to a certain degree for my style, so I'm learning to choose which areas I want to, e.g. subtly add some blue or green or change the warmth of the lighting, etc, but I need real references to be able to do this, not AI. Also, like with the first point, you want to pick a reference that highlights what you actually want to study and start building your way up stepwise. For example, with lighting, you don't want to go for the most complex lighting scenario straight away and rather work your way up, because otherwise you'll feel that it's so hard you'll lose motivation and just give up, or at least that's what I do. I think it's also worth choosing a reference that includes a few things you're also comfortable with drawing to keep your motivation up again, as you don't want to overwhelm yourself. Now that you've finally got yourself a reference, you want to take a general overall look at the reference and take a note of what immediately stands out. So I'm talking values, shapes, colours, etc, and those are the biggest things that you want to start your study with. Don't get bogged down with fine details. Staying more zoomed out also helps me with this, as it forces me to focus on the bigger picture, and also I'm short-sighted, so I literally can't even see finer details if I'm not zoomed in. The way I like to work is that I will stay as zoomed out as I can for both the reference and the study and try to convey as much information as I can, and then when I'm not sure what to do next, I'll zoom in a little bit more and look more closely at the reference and my study and see how the finer details look the way they do on the reference, and to try and translate emulate that for my own study, and also figure out how I can convey that in the simplest and quickest way possible, because I personally hate spending too much time on a single painting because I just get really bored. And then of course at some point it always devolves and I'm zooming in and out and flipping back and forth, and my canvas is on all sorts of different corners of the page. You'll see that if you have followed any of my painting processes, what happens towards the later parts of a study. But at that point I've already got the key details down and a strong foundation, so it doesn't matter as much that I'm all over the place. Another thing to note is that I would avoid tracing if you can, so no judgment if you do this to practice and that's what works for you, but I don't trace because I find that forcing myself to really think about where I'm placing things next helps me to remember better and build my visual library more effectively. I guess it's a way of building connections for which step you do next when you're drawing / painting, and I find that with tracing you don't really have to think about why you're doing something, so for example why you're putting a line somewhere or making something a certain shape, and by doing it myself I find it easier to apply the same concepts to my own art in future because I've learned the reasoning behind it. But again, some people learn through muscle memory, so I'm not here to bash people for how they learn, as long as you're not obviously, you know, tracing artwork and claiming it's your own. So yeah, let's put all of this into practice with one example. So for this study my goal was to practice environmental lighting and specifically how it interacts with characters, which is a bit more complicated I know, but at this point I've done quite a few lighting studies of just characters already, so I was trying to push myself here but not jump straight into the deep end out of my comfort zone. So I feel more confident with high contrast lighting scenarios like a bright day with shadows or dark environments with bright lighting, so this time I wanted to try a low contrast lighting scenario. I also wanted to work on my backgrounds, but as I was already doing a lighting scenario that I'm not as confident with, I chose a reference that had a more simple background to again avoid completely overwhelming myself. You can see that as I mentioned previously I started by blocking out key shapes and colours, so the first thing that stood out to me when looking at this reference was the pinkish hue of the sunset, and so that's what I laid down as a base. It doesn't matter that the colour doesn't match exactly because you can always adjust it later. I also put down the same pinkish colour as some separate strokes to indicate water and the reflection of the light, but I just put it there to provide a rough impression that I'll refine later. I found that just putting something down and then adjusting it is also another way of reducing the barrier to entry for me, and it helps me to just get on with it. I think it's a common thing that the blank canvas at the start of a painting is always the most daunting part for a lot of people. Since this is a simpler background, it literally only took me a few brush strokes to put down some shapes as a base that I can start working off of. I separated the character and the background for now because I feel like the background will have such a huge effect on how the character is rendered that I need to establish it first to be able to actually identify how I'll make the character fit in. I'm going to take this away and try and apply it to future studies and paintings as well, as in establishing the background properly before I put the character in and try and render them, because previously I've always felt like my characters didn't really fit into their environments properly because I'd always draw them first and then figure out the background later, whereas I should really be thinking of the background as its own character rather than as an afterthought, though obviously I'm not going to be amazing at it right away. I was also trying to test out some new brushes here to see if I can discover some shortcuts for the city lighting in the background, but it didn't look right, so I just stuck to manually painting the dots of light. I might try and play around with it later to see if I can figure out some new techniques to use, or watch some videos from other artists to see what they use. I've always found that watching other artists' painting processes and videos and things like that have always been really helpful for me to develop my skills. I have less time now, but I used to spend ages rewatching painting processes to try and figure out why artists use certain colours or light or brush strokes, and then see if I could apply it to my own paintings, which is why I still like to post painting processes on my own channel. I can't remember if the technique was something I figured out on my own or saw someone else do, but a good way of doing reflections in water is to mirror the image, lower the opacity, and then stretch it or distort it a little to represent the waves. In hindsight, it's probably really obvious, but it wasn't to me, so now you know too. If you've been around my channel, you'll be aware of my long-term hatred of doing line art, especially if you've seen the type of thing that I classify as satisfactory thumbnail sketching / line art for my webcomic chapters. As such, I just started working on the character by putting down some rough blobs that I'll then refine, a bit like sculpting I think. I saw a video by Cynics which talked about painting like a sculptor, and the entire time I was watching it like, hey, that's me! To be honest, I think line art is probably an important and worthwhile skill to learn, but you won't be catching me doing it anytime soon. I've always liked painting more than sketching. So Once I get the major landmarks down for my study, I finally zoom into the study a little bit more to start working on finer details. And because I already had the environment down, I could start adding subtle changes to the lighting on the character, like how the tops of her shoes very slightly reflect the sky, and the part of her leg that's facing outwards towards the sunset has a very tiny amount of orange subsurface scattering on it. It's all really subtle, but being able to spot things like that in the reference and apply it to my own study helps me to remember it the next time I try and paint my own thing. Also, there's little details like how even though her shirt is in shadow, there's still darker areas for the creases, and also that I'm conveying her shirt is white, but the actual colour I'm using is a desaturated dark blue because again, she's in a low light environment. So I can't just use one single shade of blue because again, there's darker blue areas for the creases, but there's also even darker areas for ambient occlusion that exists in places like her armpits, and it's all really fine details, but spotting them in a reference and then adding them to your own work, I feel just makes them way more vibrant and less flat. At this point, I feel like the bulk of the study is done and I've learned a lot from it, so now I'm adding in my own things to see how they work. For example, more lights / reflections, saturated colours, etc. I often like to use a hard brush to add solid and obvious brush strokes to my work, which I decided to add to the water here because I find it more visually interesting, but by still comparing it to the reference, I can compare and see when I go too far and might need to rein it back a bit. Sometimes when I do a study, I aim to see how I can achieve an effect in the reference with as little effort as possible on my part, because again, I'm not very patient. Honestly, I can't stress this enough, but you don't need to stick with or match your reference 100%. You get to decide what you're going to take away from a study, and photorealism isn't the goal for everyone. So you can choose how closely you want to match the study, though it's funny I'm saying this because when I posted this study on Instagram, half of my friends didn't realise it was a study and thought it was a photo of me. Like, I don't go out enough to be taking these types of sunset pictures. Anyway, I was pretty happy with how this study turned out, but even if you're not happy with the result, try not to get too bogged down. It's a bit rich of me to say since I'm guilty of it myself and often give up on pieces, but I will admit that even with so-called failed studies, I've still learned something. I've been able to look back at what went wrong, whether it was my method or things I missed in the reference, and I can use it to inform how I'll study the next painting. I think that's represented in this video itself, where my studies have become better over time. So it used to be really hard for me to do studies, but now it's a lot easier as I've developed my technique for studying from references. So right at the end of this study, I was playing around with the filter effects to see if I might be able to find a cool new texture to use on top of my paintings, but I decided to leave it because it didn't look right. I find that studies are actually a really good place to try new techniques because you have an exact reference to compare to and see when things don't look right, which is harder I think when you're using multiple references and doing your own paintings, because at that point there's way too much going on, at least for me. Anyway, I'd say that about wraps it up for this tutorial. I really hope it was useful for you. I tried to aim it more towards an intermediate level and talk about new things rather than repeating the same information you often see, because I think a lot of art content is aimed at beginner artists, but I think this video is still hopefully useful for beginners and intermediate artists alike. But anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.